Hello again. Now, as we've already learnt, food is central to our urban health economies and form. During the last decade or so, there has been increased interest in planning and policy around food in cities. The most dominant approach to planning for food in cities has been city regionalism. So what is city regionalism? Well, city regionalism, or a focus on the city-region food system, is an approach that's emerged in the last 15 years or so. It refers to an approach that views cities not as bounded units, but as connected in many ways with their surrounding areas. City-region food systems have been defined as the complex network of actors, processes, and relationships to do with food production, processing, marketing, and consumption that exist in a given geographical region that includes a more or less concentrated urban centre and its surrounding peri-urban and rural hinterland, a regional landscape across which the flows of people, goods, and ecosystem services are managed. You can trace the development of this idea through various planning threads and set of normative ideals for local food systems. One thread goes all the way back to the earlier planning concept of the Garden City movement and the early 20th century city regional planning approach led by Geddes and Mumford. Now, within these framings, the city is viewed as being part of a wider territory. And in the case of the Garden City in particular, considerations about how food reaches urban populations was a central concern. Spaces for food production within and around the city were planned. Another thread has been the focus on urban and territorial planning and urban-rural linkages that have become prominent within UN structures. Within this work, food is seen as just one component of a wider set of focal areas, in an approach that seeks to highlight the interdependencies of urban and rural areas, and the need to consider both rural and urban in order to build sustainable, resilient societies. A final thread has been the local food agenda that emerged in the 1990s, originally in North America, in response to concerns around ecological and equity issues within the prevailing globalized food system. So the city regional approach therefore builds on both urban planning and food systems theory and practice. City regionalism takes a territorial approach, and at its heart critiques the false binary of urban and rural in the governance of food systems, environmental services, and livelihoods. As we go through this MOOC, we'll discuss how this binary is being created and reinforced by planning codes and formal governance structures. So when we're thinking about urban food security and food systems, it's really important that we remember that cities are not islands, and they draw on resources from many places. And so when we're thinking about policies, planning, and programs to address urban food security and to govern urban food systems, we need to think carefully about how these are impacted by systems outside of the city, but also how decisions within cities impact areas beyond the city. So if we think about it, globally 70% of food is consumed within urban areas. And the urban food system is therefore a considerable driver of greenhouse gas emissions, of waste, of water usage, but it also drives many livelihoods and social benefits, both within and beyond the city. So decisions around food in cities profoundly shape areas beyond the city. The question is, though, how do we imagine the governance of a food system that extends well beyond city boundaries? If we track the development of the concept of the food shed over the last 100 years or so, we can see how ideas about the relationship between cities and the places that feed it have shifted over time. We can see a broad shift from a set of considerations of where the food feeding cities was actually coming from and how to govern that system, to a focus on a set of normative ideals about where food feeding cities should come from and how to govern that system. So in 1929, Walter Hedden coined the term the food shed in his seminal text, How Great Cities Are Fed. This work was sparked by a recognition of a rapidly changing food system feeding cities, and indeed how this food system was allowing urban growth, but also recognizing the vulnerability of the system, sparked by a proposed national railway strike in the US in 1921. This risk prompted Hedden to think seriously about how cities were fed, and he developed the idea of the food shed. He drew inspiration from the concept of the watershed. In describing it, he wrote, "The drainage basin from which a river draws its water is outlined by the height of the land, making a continuous watershed or divide. Along certain ridges of the Catskill Mountains in New York State, the runoff on one slope after a heavy rainstorm will flow eastward into the Hudson River and eventually reach New York City, while the runoff from the other slope will flow westwards into the Delaware River, eventually reaching Philadelphia. And so by analogy, we may conceive of the flow of foodstuffs to consuming markets as determined by food sheds. The barriers that deflect raindrops into one river basin rather than the other are natural land elevations. while the barriers that guide and control the movements of foodstuffs are more often economic than physical. The dikes and dams which control and often stem new streams of produce are railway freight rates, protective tariffs, and inspection standards. So his idea of a food shed was a purely descriptive account, which then prompted policy and planning responses. Now, the idea of a food shed sort of fell out of use until Arthur Geertz revitalized it in the early 1990s. And he spoke of food sheds almost like as an octopus with tentacles pulling food to cities from remote or near locations. So there's a dynamism to this framing of the food shed, and a tacit acknowledgement that the urban drives these flows of food. However, over time the concept of a food shed has shifted from being largely descriptive to a much more normative concept, speaking of where cities' food should come from. So in 1996, Kloppenberg et al. Published Coming into the Food Shed as a critique of the increasingly globalized corporate food system that they saw as being destructive to natural and social communities, and they offered the idea of a local food shed as a solution to these multiple ills. And so the city-region food system approach pulls together these multiple threads as a normative vision for a localized food system responding to a range of prevailing concerns, including urbanization and concerns about the changing nature of the relationship between rural and urban areas. So the city-region food system approach pulls together these multiple threads as a normative vision for a localized food system responding to a range of prevailing concerns, including urbanization and concerns about the changing nature of relationships between rural and urban areas. Questions about how to govern these systems that extend beyond urban boundaries and how to respond to the wave of decentralization of governance to local and regional spheres of government. And to a set of concerns about the economic, environmental, and social implications of globalized food systems, and pushing in the idea of the potential of a localized food system to create more just, sustainable, and resilient cities. The FAO, together with leading NGOs like RUAF and HIVOS, have developed a set of tools to assess, plan, and govern city-region food systems. And so the big question is, how can city regionalism create a more resilient local food system? Well, the resilience of food systems relies heavily on how easily stresses and shocks can be absorbed and recovered from. So resilience refers to a system's ability to respond to and bounce back from sudden changes. So where would city regionalism fit within attempts to strengthen these systems? City regionalism can be an approach to assist a food system in building resilience to these shocks and stresses. In asserting the importance of urban and hinterland connections, city regionalism is useful in that it forces people to think about the system and systems interactions. It offers a corrective to the assumption that food will just arrive in a city market and that it doesn't really matter where it comes from as long as it's there. The work we've been doing at the African Centre for Cities has been trying to argue that you need to have a diverse food system in order to withstand shocks and stresses. And when I say a diverse food system, I mean the one that provides multiple pathways for urban residents to get food. If we compare formal and informal retailers in our cities, we'll see that they have diverse sourcing strategies, diverse logistics and geographies. For example, a chicken might reach a consumer from a Brazilian chicken farm via a processing and freezing plant and an extremely long cold chain. Or it may reach a consumer alive from a local farmer. A consumer may get white rice imported from Asia or locally grown millet. They may buy from a street vendor from a supermarket. These different pathways are all vulnerable and resilient to different shocks. And so having diverse food options, maintained by investment in the local city regional food system, provides resilience when things like the Ukraine crisis hit and grain prices increase rapidly. If there's an alternative source of staple grain, then the system's better able to withstand this kind of shock. By the same token, if you have a massive drought locally, you'd need to rely on food from outside the city's boundaries. So from this we can see that having a food system that operates through multiple different flows can be more resilient to local and global shocks. The recent IPA's food report on the impact of the Ukraine crisis noted, moving forward, it'll be crucial for all regions to rebuild more diverse production and trade systems, grounded in local and regional territories. Supplementing local supplies with imported foods provides a necessary backstop against conflicts and shocks affecting that region. By the same token, supplementing global food supply chains with stronger local and regional food systems provides insurance against food insecurity sparked by global events. If you think about it, we've all been warned about putting all our eggs in one basket. We're constantly advised to keep our options open. Financial managers recommend investors diversify their portfolios to manage risk. The city-region food system approach provides a useful corrective to the prevailing just leave it to the market approach, and forces us to think about food systems as part of wider economic, environmental and social systems beyond the city boundaries. However, I do have some concerns that this approach and its set of normative assumptions about what the food system should be has some important blind spots around things like systems beyond the city region and how they shape the potential of the localized food system, and around issues of governance. So in summary, city regionalism, while a popular approach in global planning and strategic documents, isn't without critique. In the next section, Gareth Haysom will highlight some of the emergent governance gaps in relation to city-region food systems approach.